I happened to watch this video on YouTube the other day, and it is a live debate, or it was a live debate a couple of weeks ago, July 30th, between Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks and Ben Shapiro. And, the reason I even was looking at this, I happened to see that Ben Shapiro was on the Joe Rogan Experience just a few days after he did this live debate. And that particular video has already got about 2.5 million views. And I know I'm going to be doing Joe Rogan's show next week, and I hope that my interview could get even a significant fraction of the 2.5 million views that Joe got by interviewing Ben Shapiro. But when I was looking at that, I happened to notice this YouTube video, so I checked it out. And, I was on Cenk Uygur's program one time years and years ago. I mean, maybe it was 5 years ago. He had me on the show. This is back when I was more popular. I was doing a lot more television. So he brought me on, and he disconnected me. I forget how long I was on, 5 or 10 minutes, and he couldn't handle what I was saying. And so he just disconnected me and just said I was being rude. The reality was he was being a fool. He just doesn't know that. I mean, and if you watch this whole debate, it's an hour debate with Cenk Uygur and Ben Shapiro. And believe me, I would love to do this debate. I mean, if Cenk Uygur ever hears about this YouTube video, I mean, I would challenge him to a debate in this format anytime, any place. I mean, not that I don't think Ben Shapiro made some good points. He did, but I think I would have just mopped the floor with this guy. I mean, it's amazing. He thinks he's so smart. He has no idea how little he actually knows. I mean, I can go on all day about all the misstatements that Cenk Uygur made during this 1 hour. But I want to just focus on one for the purpose of this podcast. Maybe I'll get to some of the others in future podcasts, but I wanted to just focus on taxes. Because one of the points that Cenk Uygur made during this debate was that high taxes are good, right? That we have more prosperity with higher taxes, and if we have lower taxes, then that's bad for the economy. So in his opinion, if the government takes money from the people who earn it and gives it to the people who don't earn it, that everybody is going to be better off, including the people who are being taxed. This is what this guy believes. And let me just get into some of this nonsense in a way that really Ben Shapiro let him off the hook. I mean, he didn't make some of these points that I'm going to make. Now, I know this is live and he only had an hour, so it's hard. So I'm not necessarily going to, armchair quarterback his performance. I mean, again, he said some good things, and overall, he's a good guy. But one of the things that Cenk Uygur said was that he goes back to the 1950s, and this is typical of the liberals, because they'll say, hey, look at how strong the economy was in the 1950s and 1960s. I mean, this is the epitome of the American economy. And income tax rates were 91%, actually 92% in the early 50s. They cut them to 91%. I mean, why bother, right? Oh, taxes are at 92%. Hey, let's cut them. Okay, let's make them 91%. I mean, I don't know if somebody thought that was a tax cut. I wonder if there was anybody that opposed that thought that was a giveaway to the rich to cut their taxes from 92% to 91%. But 91% is where taxes were for most of the 1950s and the early part of the 1960s. In fact, when I was born in 1963, the top tax rate was still 91%. And then John Kennedy cut them. His famous tax cuts brought the top rate down from 91 down to 70, right? So still pretty high. But Cenk Uygur's point was that, hey, we had these high taxes, 90% taxes, and the economy was strong. America was wealthy, and therefore high taxes are good because we had a strong economy and we had high taxes simultaneously. Therefore, high taxes must be good for the economy. And of course, this is false logic, right? It's like saying, oh, I'm eating a banana and it's raining. Oh, therefore, eating a banana caused the rain. Right? Those two things are unrelated. They have nothing to do with one another. And the fact that we had a wealthy economy in the 1950s and 60s and that we still had high taxes they're just two things that happen to occur at the same time. It's not that the high taxes were the reason for the prosperity. In fact, it's the reverse. The reason that we were so prosperous in the 1950s and 1960s is not because of how high the taxes were then during those decades, but how low they were in the decades before that. See, the 1950s didn't just happen overnight. And, the only response that Ben Shapiro had was that, well, we were wealthy in the 50s and 60s because we won the Second World War and all the rest of the world was decimated. And so that's why we were so rich. That's not true. I mean, that is not the way to respond to this. I mean, we were wealthy before the Second World War. We were a mighty power before the war began. Yes, once, Great Britain was in ruins and Germany and Japan, we were the last man standing. But that didn't immediately create the standard of living that Americans enjoyed in the 50s and 60s. That was a byproduct of the economic growth of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, when we had no taxes at all. See, the reason that we created such a prosperous society, such a strong middle class, was because we had no taxes, right? After the end of the Civil War, right, and we finished that, you take, 1870 through 1913, which was the introduction of the income tax rate was zero. Nobody paid any income taxes during that time. That's the time of the Industrial Revolution. That's when all the immigrants were coming to America, the 1880s, the 1890s, 1900s. That's when all four of my grandparents came over here from Eastern Europe, right? There were no taxes. There was massive economic growth when the tax rate was zero. Now, when they started the income tax in 1913, the top bracket was 7%. That's still very low. And in fact, initially, they wanted to cap it at 10%. And the reason they didn't is because the objection was, well, if we put a 10% cap, they might actually raise it to 10%. Well, then they should have capped it at 7. But unfortunately, they didn't cap it. And of course, this is the old camel's nose under the tent. The minute you have an income tax, Congress couldn't resist the temptation to raise it. And then as soon as we had the First World War, which is another reason why we shouldn't have got that war, because, America loses every war, because under a war, the government, grabs power and raises taxes. And so in the First World War, they raised the income tax quickly up to 77%. By 1918, the income tax was 77%. Now, they slowly started to lower it. And so by 1925, it was back down to 25%. And it stayed there until the Depression. And that's really what helped make the Depression so much worse, is because they jacked income taxes up. So in 1932, under FDR, the top rate shot up to 63%. That's why we were still in the Depression when World War II started. And in fact, when the war started in 1940, right, that's when they jacked the rates up to 81%. They got as high as 94% during 1944. This was all to fight and finance the Second World War. And in fact, it wasn't until 1943 when we passed the victory tax. That was the withholding tax. That's when the average American, for the first time in history, started paying any income taxes. And so these were all wartime taxes. Now, also, there were no Social Security taxes in the 19th century. In fact, no one paid any Social Security taxes until the 1930s. And then it was only a 1% tax on a small portion of your income. And if you were self-employed, you were exempted. So if you were a small businessman, you didn't pay any Social Security tax. Now you're paying 15% on your first 100 and some odd thousand, and then you pay the Medicare tax, 3%, 3.9% on everything. So back then, you had no income taxes, really no payroll taxes. That's what built up the American middle class. That's why you had such a high standard of living in the 1950s. It's not because the wartime taxes were so high. See, the problem is those taxes were never lowered. See, once the government won the war, they kept the high taxes. And it's not a coincidence that the 1950s, right, really marks the zenith of America's power, of America's might, of America's standard of living, certainly on a relative basis, relative to the rest of the world, but even just relative to itself.